Hello? Can you hear me? How does it sound? Okay, fine. So they asked me to squeeze our talk into 45 minutes, so I'll try to be quick with the introductions. We're going to talk about Kanban today and how it is applied in the real world, or at least how I applied it in the real world. But before we start, a few words about myself. My name is Kiryl. I'm from Minsk, Belarus. I work for EPAM Systems. Has anyone heard of that? Well, that's a big independent software vendor. 20,000 plus employees worldwide with its roots in Belarus. I also work as an Agile trainer at AgileLAB, which is a team of independent trainers. It's kind of also international, but mostly we do our trainings also in Belarus. I've started 9 years ago in the IT as a software developer and switched to Scrum Master about 4 years ago. So this is me. By this slide, you probably also can tell I can draw a bit, just a bit. And now to the point. Before we start, I'd like to warn you about this talk. I'm not going to share a big success story with you. I'm going to talk about my experience and my learnings, but I think it's also important because it's important to see what people run into during their daily work, not just read about the success stories. So what I like to do today, I understand that when you read the books, the textbooks, oftentimes it's hard to understand what do they mean with the theory, right? So I will try to connect the theory with the practice and show you how Kanban can be applied in practice. And I will also share my own learnings, my own experience about how I did things and how this actually worked out. So this is what this talk is going to be about. And I'd like to give you a bit of a background so that you understand the constraints where the team I applied Kanban had to operate in. So as I said, I work for a software vendor. Mostly I work with some customer that produces software. In this case, it was a huge international corporation. I can't name it because of the policies of my company, but I will just tell you that they produce a legal research tool for the US market, and this is a leader. The tool is very complex. It's quite old. The product we've been working with was the second generation of this tool. Because of that, it has some characteristics. Well, first of all, the code base, it was humongous. And when I say humongous, I actually mean it. It was very big, very big. Just so that you imagine, the whole product is worked on by about 2,000 people. This also includes subject matter experts, all the feature owners and whatnot, but yeah, 2,000 people, it's quite large. Also because of that, they have a pretty complex Agile process. It was a custom-made, scaled Agile process. But yeah, that's what they have. Also, the business domain, as I said, it is legal research. It's quite complex because you have to know all these legal terms and all the stuff in it. So it's oftentimes for a developer hard to understand what's actually going on there. And then the team itself, it was also pretty big. So yeah, big was the word. At times, it went up to 17 people. Eventually, it stabilized at 13. So it's by no means your average Scrum team. It was pretty huge. And then the tasks the team worked on were minor enhancements. And again, when I say minor, it's mostly from the user's perspective, because When in the application you need to change a button, it eventually turns into a lot of research, a lot of debugging, a lot of understanding all this legal stuff, and understanding what's the right way to actually make this little change. So from the end user's perspective, little enhancements. From the developer's perspective, things that may take a lot of time. So this is kind of the background. Now let's talk about Kanban. Is there anybody who has never heard the word Kanban at all, who doesn't know what it is? Could you raise your hand, please? Okay, so today is going to be like a sneak peek for you. I'm not going to, educate you from the very beginning, but you'll see a version of it. Is there anybody who knows what Kanban is theoretically or has tried it in practice? Could you raise your hands? Okay, much more, great. I think that what I'm going to talk about today is going to be most helpful for you. Is there anybody who thinks they're an expert in Kanban? Like writing articles, maybe a couple of books. Okay, one guy at least, kind of almost expert. Okay, you're going to correct my mistakes, okay? Cool. So this is Kanban. This is basically what it is. It's just 10 statements of 4 principles, or foundational principles, as they call it, and 6 practices. The principles say that you start what you have, you agree to change, you respect what you have initially, and also you try to foster acts of leadership on all levels. The practices say that you visualize, you limit WIP, you manage flow, then you set up feedback loops. What else? You make process policies explicit. Well, anything you have, you make it explicit. And then you improve collaboratively and evolve evolutionary. Now I will try to explain you what all these vague sentences mean. And we're going to start with what I think is more simple to actually implement and more simple to understand. And we're going to start with practical things and then finish with some philosophy. So when you start with Kanban and you don't know what to do, the rule of thumb is start with visualizing. So that's what I did. And when you start visualizing, first you want to visualize the types of work you have. And in this team, we had business stories, and this is the customer's vocabulary. Basically, you may call it user stories or features or anything. This is something requested by the business, which brings value. Then there are also bugs. Bugs are some defect found in production after a business story has been released. So this is an important thing, because if we find a bug during the development, that's a different thing. And we're going to talk about it. And then we also have tasks. Tasks are some pieces of work that we need to accomplish, but that don't fall under any of the other 2 categories. So these are the 3 types of work. Basically, we found out that all the work we did fell under one of those 3. But those 3 were the the high-level types of work, the independent work. That is something that you find on your product backlog and that you can prioritize. What we also had was were the sub-items, and we had 2 types for them: sub-tasks and sub-bugs. And just keep them in mind for now, because we're going to talk about them in more detail in a while. But this is what we had. So one thing just to remember is that you just cannot have a sub-bug or a sub-task without a business story. It must be associated to some business story. So this is kind of what the work types that we had. So now, as you have the work types identified, you want to identify the stages that they go through. This is what makes your Kanban board. Here, again, nothing fancy. So you can see there are a few columns which basically represent the stages of work. A few things to note. You can see there are some columns that represent the done state. So not only an activity, but also the end of the activity. Because what you want with your visualization is you want to highlight anything that's valuable for your team. And it's valuable, for instance, for people to see that some work has passed, some activity, and for testers, for instance, it's valuable to see that the development has been done, and now they can start testing. So that's why we have this column implemented, which basically means development done. So this is your visualization. Now, a question here is, how do you get to this? How do you create your visualization? And my suggestion is that don't play smart. Don't try to be the smart guy here if you're like a manager or a coach or a team lead, because you are not. And what you want to do is you want to go to your team and talk to them, maybe one-on-one, maybe, I don't know, take them together, but you want to interview them and actually try to find out what exactly the team is doing. And then you create this board. Maybe first you start with a list, right? And then you show it again to the team and double check that this is how the reality looks like. Because at this point, you don't want to invent anything. You start what you have, right? Remember the first principle? Start what you have. So now you have, in the end, you have this board. And then you may decide to actually somehow enhance it. So if you take a look here, there are two what we call swim lanes. Bugs have its own swim lane, so on the board you can see the bugs flowing kind of independently of the other kinds of work. And this was added later on. And why? Because again, this was valuable for the team, because at some point in time they realized we want to see when we have bugs, because when we see the bugs independently, we can actually start working on them as soon as they arrive. And after that, we also agreed that if there is any bug on the board, this means that we must start fixing it. So at least one bug on the board, start fixing it. That was the agreement. And I'm already kind of jumping to the next principle, which is making policies explicit. But this is how visualization evolves. But again, you want to start with what you have. One thing I'd like to draw special attention to is this column, which is called preparation. And why do I think it's special? Well, preparation is kind of a research and analysis stage that the team had been doing from the very beginning. Because, as I said, complex business domain, huge code base, a lot of research must be done before you can even start working on something. But how they did it, they never realized that this is actually happening. So they started some research and then jumped to development and then tripped over some missing information or lack of understanding or lack of requirements from the business. And that was pretty annoying. What was also annoying to the customer was that he could never understand, to our product owner, he could never understand when actually the real work has started. Because it was kind of, well, it's kind of development, but it's not. So when I talked to the team, I realized that this is something that they do. And okay, I decided we need to visualize this. So I added this stage to the column, to the board. And what it ended up with quite a healthy effect, because just merely the presence of this column made the team realize that they are doing this work, and probably they want to complete it first as much as they can and make the story ready before they can start the development. And this because of this, the customer was now like happier because he could now understand, is this really development or are we just preparing for development? And the team also could understand that, okay, we need to do some research before we can actually start. Yeah, I don't say here that they try to get all the information because it's not possible, but what they tried with this is get as much information as they could at this stage. So, yeah, this is the visualization. So as you can see, just visualization by itself can actually promote some healthy changes. Now, as we have the board set up, let's fill in with stuff. So this is kind of how it looked like in reality. A few stories here and there, a few tasks, a few bugs. So now one more thing. Have you noticed anything? Something blinked. I'm sorry that it's not very well seen here. So here and here, I have highlighted two blockers. This is also something we want to visualize. They actually have a red glow around that. Probably you don't see that. So why do we need to visualize blockers? Because also we want to see if something is impeding us. A blocker basically is anything that prevents a card from moving forward or from moving left to right. Yeah, so this is pretty straightforward. And now I would like to go into the next practice, which I found also quite a simple one to understand. This one is make process policies explicit. I'm not going to tell you about all the policies that we had. You may put them somewhere on a wiki. We had them on Confluence. You may put them, just stick them on the board underneath so that everybody sees them. What I'd like to talk about is about the rule that we had, and it is related to blockers. The rule said that a card can only move from left to right on the board. This means like from the beginning to the end, no way back. Well, exceptions are possible, of course, but this is the general rule I'd like to focus on. And why is that? And here I'd like to go off on a tangent a little bit. I would say that our visualization is actually a model. Would you agree to that? Yes or no? Well, kind of, yeah. But let's go with it. So I think it's a model of reality. And a model, actually, is some representation of reality, but it is not a reality. It is some approximation of it. And a model is created to serve a goal. This is how it's done in science and in analysis, right? You create a model in a way that it shows the reality from the side that that is helping you to reach a goal. And I would say, to put it simply, that a team's goal is to produce more stuff quickly. And this is where this rule comes into play. Because with this rule, with this model, it actually, I believe, incentivizes good behavior. Because without it, say, we have a blocker. Something has popped up during testing. An intuitive way to do is, okay, well, now we need to develop it again. So we take it back to the development, right? Right? Wrong. No, it should stay there. It cannot move back. Why is that? Because it should be there and bother the team that this is kind of in testing, but we need to do some development to make it advance. It should be annoying. And this way, it promotes that the team actually puts effort to fix it and fix it fast. Now, but we also want to visualize that there is some work happening in the development. And for that, exactly, we have sub-bugs. Here, we create a sub-bug and put it in development. And this way we know that some additional work popped up out of nowhere, and now it eats some of our development time. And say, if there is a missing requirement, we may create another sub-bug and put it in the preparation column. And this way we highlight that there was some information we could have discovered beforehand, but we didn't. And until those two are fixed, we cannot move this item. Yeah, and so as I said, always think of your Kanban board as a model. And when you just visualize, I think it's just like you're using 50% of the potential. If you want it to work full throttle, then you need to actually create some rules and make your visualization the way that it fosters good behavior. So this is about the visualization and explicit policies. Now let's talk about limiting WIP. And by the way, WIP means work in progress. So anything that has been started and is not done yet is work in progress. Here, this is anything that spans from preparation to verification. It's work in progress. So with Kanban, we want to limit WIP. Oh yeah, and by the way, I think that these two practices kind of the most, where all the hard work happens in Kanban, where this is the dirty part of it. Because with visualization policies, well, you make them and they kind of work on their own. But here is where you can, you actually need to work, to use your mind muscles. Limiting WIP. Just shortly, the purpose of limiting WIP is that the lower, basically, you have, again, very simply, the lower the WIP, the faster you complete stuff. I don't want to go into detail with that, but I'd like to talk more about how you actually implement this again in practice. So, what you want to do is you want to start with relatively high limits. And why is that? Because you don't want to put too much stress on the team from the very beginning. Because if you do, they will start running into a wall if the limits are too low from the beginning. And they will get demotivated pretty soon. And they won't ever believe that they could work with the limits like that, and they will just disregard the limits altogether. They will never respect them. So you want to start with the limits pretty high, so there is a lot of room for maneuvering. But then, in order to make this effective and in order to get to managing flow, you want to start reducing them gradually. Not in a big leap, but gradually. What we ended up with was 10 for development, 6 for ready. Other things were well, we guessed them pretty well from the beginning. So there were two reasons. But before I talk about the reasons, sometimes I hear from different people that you want to set the limits for development, say, 2 times the number of developers that you have. Again, I don't think that's a good idea. But at the very least, it was not a very good idea in our case. Because of the 2 reasons. First, the testers felt overloaded. And then the stuff just took too much time to complete. So we tried to lower the limits more so that the work evens up and testers don't receive work in large batches, like when there is no work a month and then suddenly you have 20 items ready for testing. So with these limits, we were able to unload the testers a little bit, but what's even more important, I would say, and it's related to managing the flow, is that limits like that actually forced developers to start pairing up or making triplets and work on the same story together. And before that, they never believed that that could be done, but they tried because we agreed, okay, we should respect the limits. And they started trying it. And eventually people start coming to me and saying, well, you know, we completed that story faster than we could have if we didn't pair up. And this is the healthy effect that the limits had on the team. Because not only they started completing the things faster, but they also started getting together as a team. Before that, there was an issue with that because everyone worked on their own stuff, and now they could actually team up and work on the same thing. There was one more effect to that. By limiting WIP, we made it again more clear to the customer what's going on with the team, what we're working on, because it was before that it was usual for him to say, well, we're going so wide, I can't even understand what we're working on. After that, he started to understand what's happening and when something actually is going to be completed. So this is about managing flow. And to put it short, managing flow is about making where when something is stuck, you try to move it. When something takes too long, you try to take steps for it to be completed faster. And eventually, the whole flow is more even. The next practice is about feedback loops. And here, I don't want to spend much time on this practice in particular because the way you can set up feedback loops is probably a separate topic in its own. But a few things, what I found about this practice is by the name, it's sometimes hard to understand what actually they mean. But basically, feedback loops is anything that you can set up that brings you information about what you're doing. So a few examples, retrospectives, for instance. This is a feedback loop about the process. And metrics. This is the feedback loop about the flow or feedback loops. And one thing I'd like to tell here, don't be over-obsessed with metrics. A couple of holistic metrics that measure the entire productivity of the entire team is fine, because if you put too much focus on local metrics, you're becoming prone to local optimizations, and that's a bad thing. So yeah, feedback loops. Okay, so this is, we've covered probably the most of the method, and we have a few things left. And here is where I want to get back to the principles and to the last practice about the changing. So, well, what I've learned about Kanban, that it is actually quite a good fit for offshore development, because not just for offshore, but for offshore is pretty good thing. Why is that? Because oftentimes it's very hard to get buy-in from the customer, because they don't want to invest their time, and especially so because customers usually don't trust some vendor. Well, it's not the work you're doing, it's my business, it's not your business, why should I trust you? So where does the Kanban fit this? Let's take a look at the first three principles. You start what you have, you agree on evolutionary change, and then you respect what you have in the beginning. This actually means that from the very beginning, you don't have to change anything. And when you start changing things, you do this in very little baby steps. And this means that the upfront investment is actually very low. You can even start doing this without the involvement of the customer, and that's actually what I did in my team. So I thought, well, the investment is low, let's just try it and see what happens. And then if the things go well, we can show that to the customer. If the things don't go well, okay, we'll try something else. The things went well, and I hope if you try Kanban, the things will go well with you too. And this is actually where it is very crucial to get the customer or your manager or anybody, program manager, I don't know, business owner on board. And here is why. If you don't do this, well, first of all, your explicit policies are never going to work to their full potential. How would the customer know why you're working on this bug and not on that bug, or why you have picked up this item and not that item, or why it takes so slow, or why it doesn't take so slow? And then, eventually, after team has improved, you will inevitably bump into some organizational issues. Well, in my experience, that always happens. So there are always some organizational constraints, and you will eventually bump into them. And in order to make the changes on the organizational level, you have to have the buy-in from the authority, from the customer, and this is where you go to them, because otherwise these two things are never going to work, which is you will never get your acts of leadership on every level, and you will never get your incremental collaborative changes. So yeah, get your customer on board. This is basically everything I wanted to say about Kanban, and to conclude, I'd like to share a few more learning points that I've got while I was implementing this in my team. Well, first of all, I think Kanban is a very good tool. It's a great tool, and it actually solves the task that it states. And the task, I think, is it creates an environment for evolutionary change, for promoting evolutionary change. And you've seen that with the examples that I showed you, that this preparation column had some healthy effects, promoted change, the WIP limits promoted change, and so forth. But what is important to know that as with any change and with any activity related to change, like with coaching or psychotherapy, it is a very cumbersome and difficult work that you need to do. And you have to put your time and your effort in this work. And no one actually is going to guarantee you a good result. A good thing, again, as I said with Kanban, is the upfront investment is very low. So what I would say is, yeah, go read about Kanban. Go read the book. It is a very good reading. For me, it was an eye-opener. And try it. And I hope you like it as much as I do. And guys, basically everything is in your hands. So go and try. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe someone has a question?
What didn't work in your project and caused you big learning?
Okay, what didn't work? I was never able to measure a lead time properly because it always took just too much time. We completed, like the team completed, a story took a few weeks to complete, and in a year you don't have just enough statistics to make any good conclusions of that. And what I did learn about that, well, the simplest thing is that if you can't measure lead time, don't bother. Because it's better not focus on some, you know, I know on maybe good practices than on lead time, because if you don't have reliable statistics, your metrics are good for nothing, basically. That's one thing. Yeah, the other thing, what didn't work, that's what I mentioned. We also bumped up into organizational constraints, and we actually were never able to make the things rolling on the higher level. So the team reached its maximum with what they could, and then the progress just stopped. And actually, I think after I left the team, it started deteriorating a little bit.
Okay.
What about retrospectives? How often did you hold them, and can you tell an example of an interesting insight, an act of leadership, an idea that came from the team and maybe, you know, turned things upside down?
About how often? Well, here I can say that before we started Kanban, it was actually more like Scrum with this team and the other teams. So there were 2-week iterations, but yeah, because nothing could be completed in 2 weeks, we just ditched 2 weeks planning, but we still kept the 2 weeks retrospectives. As for the acts of leadership, that's a tough question. I don't think I can remember anything right now. It was quite a while ago. Well, one thing I can name, I guess, people try to suggest their own solutions. Unfortunately, they were often rejected because of the risks. But yeah, that's the other thing that failed. But this is something that happened. With the low WIP limits, I also, well, I had to convince some of the people from the team, but the others just started making those micro teams on their own. So I guess this is an example.
And could you tell us, let's say, how to measure team's predictability, or when the project, let's say, can be delivered? Not to put the team into constraints, but to know, let's say, if the business is asking for the project, when it can be delivered. Just based on what can we predict that? Okay, well, yeah, I can give you a general answer because that was not the case with this team. As I said, the statistics were not reliable, but the general answer is that if you measure lead time, and if you measure work in progress, and if you measure throughput is how much stuff we do in, say, 2 weeks, then you can like take, for instance, we complete a story for like in 10 days. Now we have a span of 3 months. How much can we do in 3 months? You take your WIP, work in progress, average, and you take this lead time average and divide using Little's law, and there you get it. There is an article about that by David Anderson on the internet, which describes in detail how you can do this. Yeah, if you Google something like, well, actually, I don't remember, but yeah, you should Google your question and David Anderson. It's on his website. I'm sorry, I just don't remember exactly.
Okay, so someone else? One
Here,
more.
there's a question.
There was marked blocks, green with a red stroke, yeah?
Yep.
And,
yep.
And they are creating sub-tasks and sub-bugs.
Yeah.
Is there any limits for sub-tasks, the count of sub-tasks?
Yeah, the general limits apply.
So if one block creates, for example, 20 sub-bugs, it's okay, or is have some deadline for?
We must, yeah, a good question. There was another policy for that, if because of the sub-bugs a limit is broken, we must clear the sub-bugs first. So the whole idea was that you should stop starting and start finishing. So if there is something that's almost complete, and then it produces a number of sub-bugs, then you need first to fix the sub-bugs to unblock the item and complete it, instead of taking something else. And this is why the general limits also applied. So yeah, at some points in time we had a situation when, say, for the limit of 10, we had like 13 items because of sub-bugs. And at this point, the team had to fix those 3 or 4 sub-bugs that it had before they could do anything else.
Probably an usual question for Agile, handling dependencies. How did you handle dependencies between the user stories, or was it a job for the product owners? I understood you had one.
Okay. So in our case, since that was not it was more like a maintenance development than an active development. So there was no big planning with like big bunches of stuff. So we manage the dependencies mostly ad hoc. Sometimes the team was able to foresee that there is going to be a dependency. Sometimes it could only be seen only after the work has started. So I can share some good approach with you here. But what I can say is that the dependencies were managed and discovered by the team. One more thing I may add here is that actually the WIP limits themselves may be your kind of buffer for dependencies. So the idea is that the less mature the organization is, the more there are organizational blockers or dependencies, the more you want to have room for these dependencies, and the higher you set the limits.
My question is, you told that you work with big teams.
Yep.
So from my experience, the big teams, the corporations and so on, they use very conservative software. So my question is, what kind of tools you use for your projects to manage the Kanban? Because
yeah, so also a good question. The customer used TFS, but an older version of TFS that didn't have this functionality. So we started using Jira, because at EPAM we have Jira, and it was, for the team, it was free. So we started using Jira for this visualization. I was hesitating between Jira and a physical board, and then eventually decided to go for Jira because of different reasons. But yeah, but we used basically Jira as just as a board. No information was stored there. Okay, yeah, I like this question very much. I think that's a wrong question to ask. Or, well, no, your question is okay. The wrong question is what is better, or what should I use, Scrum or Kanban? Because That's not a question to ask, because these are different things and they serve different purposes. Scrum is a framework for a process. Kanban is not a process, it's a method of managing workflow. So it can be used, and more so, the first principle says that you start with what you have. So it kind of implies you should have some process in place in order to use Kanban. Kanban, you apply it on top of something in order to start making changes. So yes, you can use Scrum and Kanban together. That's what I'm doing right now in a Scrum team. Because it's more about, you have to visualize, you have to limit WIP. There is no contradiction with Scrum whatsoever. So yeah. And yeah, you can also use Kanban with waterfall or with your own process or with any process you like. It's just a method of managing workflow.
Okay, so I think it's time to end. And I want to say thank you that you come here and share your experience. And this is a small gift from Agile.
Thanks.
Lietuva. And one more time, applause from... Okay, don't forget.